The Timucua were a Native American people who lived in northeast and north-central Florida and southeast Georgia. They were the largest indigenous group in that area and consisted of about 35 chiefdoms, many leading thousands of people. The various groups of Timucua spoke several dialects of the Timucua language. At the time of European contact, the territory occupied by speakers of Timucuan dialects occupied about 19,200 square miles, and was home to between 50,000 and 200,000 Timucuans. It stretched from the Altamaha River in Cumberland Island in present-day Georgia as far south as Lake George in central Florida, and from the Atlantic Ocean west to the Ocilla River in the Florida Panhandle, though it reached the Gulf of Mexico at no more than a couple of points. The name Timucua came from the exonym used by the Satiriwa to refer to the Utana, another group to the west of the St. Johns River. The Spanish came to use the term more broadly for other peoples in the area. Eventually it became the common term for all peoples who spoke what is known as the Timucuan language. While alliances and confederacies arose between the chiefdoms from time to time, the Timucua were never organized into a single political unit. The various groups of Timucua speakers practiced several different cultural traditions. The people suffered severely from the introduction of Eurasian infectious diseases, to which they had no immunity. By 1595, the population was estimated to have been reduced from 200,000 to 50,000 and 13 chiefdoms remained. By 1700, the population of the tribe had been reduced to 1,000. Warfare against them by the English colonists and native allies completed their extinction as a tribe soon after the turn of the 19th century. Name: the word Timucuan may derive from Thimagona or Timangua, an exonym used by the Satiriwa chiefdom of present-day Jacksonville for their enemies, the Utana, who lived inland along the St. Johns River. Both groups spoke dialects of the Timucua language. The French followed the Satiriwa in this usage, but the Spanish applied the term Timucua much more widely to groups within a wide section of interior North Florida. In the 16th century they designated the area north of the Santa Fe River between the St. Johns and Suwannee rivers as the Timucua province, which they incorporated into the mission system. The dialect spoken in that province became known as Timucua. During the 17th century, the province of Timucua was extended to include the area between the Suwannee River and the Ocilla River, thus extending its scope. Eventually, Timucua was applied to all speakers of the various dialects of the Timucua language. History: the pre-Columbian era was marked by regular, routine, and probably small tribal wars with neighbors. The Timucua were organized into as many as 35 chiefdoms, each of which had hundreds of people in assorted villages within its purview. They sometimes formed loose political alliances, but did not operate as a single political unit. An archaeological dig in St. Augustine in 2006 revealed a Timucuan site dating back to between 1100 and 1300 AD, predating the European founding of the city by more than 2 centuries. Included in the discovery were pottery, with pieces from the Macon, Georgia area indicating an expansive trade network, and 2 human skeletons. It is the oldest archaeological site in the city. The Timucua may have been the first American natives to see the landing of Juan Ponce de Leon near St. Augustine in 1513. This notion is up for debate since most historians now agree that the Ponce de Leon landing point was more likely much further south in AI's territory, near what is today Melbourne Beach. If so, Timucuan contact with the particular expedition was unlikely. Later, in 1528, Panfilo de Narvaez's expedition passed along the western fringes of the Timucua territory. In 1539, Hernando de Soto led an army of more than 500 men through the western parts of Timucua territory, stopping in a series of villages of the Ocal, Potano, northern Utah, and Yastaga branches of the Timucua on his way to the Appalachian domain. His army seized the food stored in the villages, took women for consorts, and forced men and boys to serve as guides and bearers. The army fought 2 battles with Timucua groups, resulting in heavy Timucua casualties. De Soto was in a hurry to reach the Appalachian domain, where he expected to find gold and sufficient food to support his army through the winter, so he did not linger in Timucua territory. De Soto's quick departure was prompted by an effective guerrilla defense organized by the warrior chief Timucuan, whose people beheaded 14 of the invading conquistadors while suffering relatively few casualties compared to the massacres unleashed by the Spaniards in other places. In 1564, French Huguenots led by René Goulend and Lord Onnier founded Fort Caroline in present-day Jacksonville and attempted to establish further settlements along the St. Johns River. After initial conflict, the Huguenots established friendly relations with the local natives in the area, primarily the Timucua under the Cacique Saturiwa. Sketches of the Timucua drawn by Jacques Lemoyne de Morgues, one of the French settlers, have proven valuable resources for modern ethnographers in understanding the people. The next year, the Spanish under Pedro Menéndez de Avilés surprised the Huguenots and ransacked Fort Caroline, killing everyone but 50 women and children and 26 escapees. The rest of the French had been shipwrecked off the coast and picked up by the Spanish, who executed all but 20 of them. This brought French settlement in Florida to an end. These events caused a rift between the natives and Spanish, though Spanish missionaries were soon out in force. The Timucua history changed after the Spanish established St. Augustine in 1565 as the capital of the province of Florida. From here, Spanish missionaries established missions in each main town of the Timucuan chiefdoms, including the Santa Isabel de Utah-Hica mission in what is now southern Georgia, for the Utah-Hica. By 1595, the Timucuan population had shrunk by 75%, primarily from epidemics of new infectious diseases introduced by contact with Europeans, and war. By 1700, the Timucuan population had been reduced to just 1,000. In 1703 the British with the Creek, Catawba, and Uchee began killing and enslaving hundreds of the Timucua. 17 years later the number had dropped to just 250. In 1726 there were 176, and by 1752 only 26 remained. By the time the United States acquired Florida in 1821, only 5 or fewer Timucua remained. They became extinct as a people. In 1763, when Spain ceded Florida to Great Britain, the Spanish took the less than 100 Timucua and other natives to Cuba. Research is underway in Cuba to discover if any Timucua descendants exist there. Some historians believe a small group of Timucua may have stayed behind in Florida or Georgia and possibly assimilated into other groups such as the Seminoles. Many Timucua artifacts are stored at the Florida Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida and other museums. Tribes. The Timucua were divided into a number of different tribes or chiefdoms, each of which spoke one of the 9 or 10 dialects of the Timucua language. The tribes can be placed into eastern and western groups. The eastern Timucua were located along the Atlantic coast and on the Sea Islands of northern Florida and southeastern Georgia along the St. Johns River and its tributaries, and among the rivers, swamps and associated inland forests in southeastern Georgia, possibly including the Okefenokee Swamp. They usually lived in villages close to waterways, participated in the St. John's culture or in unnamed cultures related to the Wilmington Savannah culture, and were more focused on exploiting the resources of marine and wetland environments. All of the known Eastern Timucua tribes were incorporated into the Spanish mission system starting in the late 16th century. The Western Timucua lived in the interior of the upper Florida Peninsula, extending to the Ocala River on the west and into Georgia to the north. They usually lived in villages in forests and participated in the Alachua, Suwannee Valley or other unknown cultures. Because of their environment, they were more oriented to exploiting the resources of the forests. Earlier scholars such as John Swanton and John Goggin identified tribes around Tampa Bay, Tocobaga, the Uzita, and the Mocoso as Timucua speakers, classed by Goggin as Southern Timucua. However, some of these tribes appear not to have spoken Timucua. Eastern Timucua. The largest and best known of the Eastern Timucua groups were the Mocama, who lived in the coastal areas of what are now Florida and southeastern Georgia, from St. Simon's Island to south of the mouth of the St. John's River. They gave the name to the Mocama province, which became one of the major divisions of the Spanish mission system. They spoke a dialect also known as Mocama, which is the best attested of the Timucua dialects. At the time of European contact, there were two major chiefdoms among the Mocama, the Satiriwa and the Takatikiru, each of which had a number of smaller villages subject to them. The Satiriwa were concentrated around the mouth of the St. John's in what is now Jacksonville, and had the main village on the river's south bank. European contact with the Eastern Timucua began in 1564 when the French Huguenots under René Goulend and Lord Onnier established Fort Caroline in Satiriwa territory. The Satiriwa forged an alliance with the French, and at first opposed the Spanish when they arrived. Over time, however, they submitted to the Spanish and were incorporated into the mission system. The important mission San Juan del Puerto was established at the main village. It was here that Francisco Pareja undertook his studies of the Timucua language. The Takatikiru lived on Cumberland Island in present-day Georgia and controlled villages on the coast. They too were incorporated into the Spanish mission system, with Mission San Pedro de Mocama being established in 1587. Other Eastern Timucua groups lived in southeastern Georgia. The Ikafu and Kaskang tribes occupied the Georgia mainland north of the Satilla River, adjacent to the Gwale. They spoke the Atafi dialect of Timucua. The Ufera tribe lived on the coast opposite to Cumberland Island and spoke the Ufera dialect. The Ibi tribe lived inland from the Ufera, and had 5 towns located 14 leagues from Cumberland Island. Like the Ikafu and Kaskang, they spoke the Atafi dialect. All these groups participated in a culture that was intermediate between the St. John's and Wilmington Savannah cultures. The Oconee lived further west, perhaps on the east side of the Okefenokee Swamp. Both the Ibi and Oconee eventually received their own missions, while the coastal tribes were subject to San Pedro on Cumberland Island. Up the St. John's River to the south of the Satiriwa were the Utana, later known as the Agua Dulce or Agua Fresca tribe. They lived along the river from roughly the Palatka area south to Lake George. They participated in the St. John's culture and spoke the Agua Dulce dialect. The area between Palatka and downtown Jacksonville was relatively less populated, and may have served as a barrier between the Utana and Satiriwa, who were frequently at war. In the 1560s the Utana were a powerful chiefdom of over 40 villages. However, by the end of the century the Confederacy had crumbled, with most of the diminished population withdrawing to 6 towns further south on the St. John's. The Acuera lived along the Ocklawaha River, and spoke the Acuera dialect. Western Timucua. Three major Western Timucua groups, the Potano, Northern Utana, and Yastaga, were incorporated into the Spanish mission system in the late 16th and 17th centuries. The Potano lived in north-central Florida, in an area covering Alachua County and possibly extending west to Cofa at the mouth of the Suwannee River. They participated in the Alachua culture and spoke the Potano dialect. They were among the first Timucua peoples to encounter Europeans, suffering an attack by Hernando de Soto's expedition in 1538. They were frequently at war with the Utana tribe, who managed to convince first the French and later the Spanish to join them in combined assaults against the Potano. They received missionaries in the 1590s and 5 missions were built in the territory by 1633. Like other Western Timucua groups, they participated in the Timucua Rebellion of 1656. North of the Potano, living in a wide area between the Suwannee and St. Johns rivers, were the Northern Utana. This name is purely a convention. They were known as the Timucua to the contemporaries. They participated in the Suwannee Valley culture and spoke the Timucua proper dialect. The Northern Utana appear to have been less integrated than other Timucua tribes, and seem to have been organized into several small local chiefdoms, with the leader of one being recognized as paramount chief. They were missionized beginning in 1597 and the territory was organized by the Spanish as the Timucua province. Over time, smaller provinces were merged into the Timucua province, thereby increasing the profile of the Northern Utana substantially. They took the forefront in the Timucua Rebellion of 1656, and the society declined severely when it was put down. On the other side of the Suwannee River from the Northern Utana were the westernmost Timucua group, the Yastaga. They lived between the Suwannee and the Orkilla River, which served as a boundary with the Appalachia. They participated in the same Suwannee Valley culture as the Northern Utana, but appear to have spoken a different dialect, perhaps Potano. Unlike other Timucua groups, the Yastaga resisted Spanish missionary efforts until well into the 17th century. They maintained high population levels significantly later than other Timucua groups, as the less frequent contact with Europeans kept them free of introduced diseases. Like other Western Timucua groups, they participated in the Timucua Rebellion. Other Western Timucua tribes are known from the earliest Spanish records, but later disappeared. The most significant of these are the Ocal, who lived in Marion County, near the modern city of Ocala, which takes its name from them. Ocal was conquered by De Soto in 1538 and the people dispersed. The town is unknown from later sources. However, both French and Spanish sources note a town named El Aquale or Ito Quale in the Acuera chiefdom, suggesting that the Ocal may have migrated east and joined the Acuera. Han has argued that the chiefdom of Mocoso, located near the mouth of the Alafia River on the eastern shore of Tampa Bay in the 16th century, was Timucuan. He suggests that the people of the chiefdom may have relocated to the village of Mocoso in Acuera province in the 17th century. Culture, organization and classes. The Timucua were not a unified political unit. Rather, they were made up of at least 35 chiefdoms, each consisting of about 2 to 10 villages, with one being primary. In 1601 the Spanish noted more than 50 caciques subject to the head caciques of Santa Elena, San Pedro, Timucua and Potano. The Takatiquiro, Satiriwa and Cascang were subject to San Pedro, while the Ufera and Ibi, neighbors of the Takatiquiro and Cascang, were independent. Villages were divided into family clans, usually bearing animal names. Children always belonged to the mother's clan. Customs. The Timucua played 2 related but distinct ball games. Western Timucua played a game known as the Appalachia ball game. Despite the name, it was as closely associated with the Western Timucua as it was with the Appalachia. It involved two teams of around 40 or 50 players kicking a ball at a goal post. Hitting the post was worth 1 point, while landing it in an eagle's nest at the top of the post was worth 2. The first team to score 11 points was the victor. The Western Timucua game was evidently less associated with religious significance, violence, and fraud than the Appalachia version, and as such missionaries had a much more difficult time convincing them to give it up. The Eastern Timucua played a similar game in which balls were thrown, rather than kicked, at a goal post. The Timucua probably also played chunky, as did the neighboring Appalachia and Gwali peoples, but there is no firm evidence of this. Archery, running, and dancing were other popular pastimes. The chief had a council that met every morning, when they would discuss the problems of the chiefdom and smoke. To initiate the meeting, the white drink ceremony would be carried out. The council members were among the more highly respected members of the tribe. Settlements. The Timucua of northeast Florida at the time of first contact with Europeans lived in villages that typically contained about 30 houses, and 200 to 300 people. The houses were small, made of upright poles and circular in shape. Palm leaf thatching covered the pole frame, with a hole at the top for ventilation and smoke escape. The houses were 15 to 20 feet across and were used primarily for sleeping. A village would also have a council house which would usually hold all of the villages. Europeans described some council houses as being large enough to hold 3,000 people. If a village grew too large, some of the families would start a new village nearby, so that clusters of related villages formed. Each village, a small cluster of related villages, had its own chief. Temporary alliances between villages for warfare were also formed. Ceremonial mounds might be in or associated with the village, but the mounds belonged to clans rather than villages. The Timucua were a semi-agricultural people and ate foods native to north-central Florida. They planted maize, beans, squash and various vegetables as part of the diet. Archaeologists' findings suggest that they may have employed crop rotation. In order to plant, they used fire to clear the fields of weeds and brush. They prepared the soil with various tools, such as the hoe. Later the women would plant the seeds using two sticks known as koa. They also cultivated tobacco. The crops were stored in granaries to protect them from the insects and weather. Corn was ground into flour and used to make corn fritters. In addition to agriculture, the Timucua men would hunt game, fish in the many streams and lakes in the area, and collect freshwater and marine shellfish. The women gathered wild fruits, palm berries, acorns, and nuts, and baked bread made from the root kuti. Meat was cooked by boiling or over an open fire known as the barbacoa, the origin of the word barbecue. Fish were filleted and dried or boiled. Broths were made from meat and nuts. After the establishment of Spanish missions between 1595 to 1620, the Timucua were introduced to European foods, including barley, cabbage, chickens, cucumbers, figs, garbanzo beans, garlic, European grapes, European greens, hazelnuts, various herbs, lettuce, melons, oranges, peas, peaches, pigs, pomegranates, sugar cane, sweet potatoes, watermelons, and wheat. The native corn became a traded item and was exported to other Spanish colonies. A black tea called black drink served a ceremonial purpose, and was a highly caffeinated casina tea, brewed from the leaves of the yapon holly tree. The tea was only consumed by males in good status with the tribe. The drink was posited to have an effect of purification, and those who consumed it often vomited immediately. This drink was integral to most Timucua rituals and hunts. Physical appearance. Spanish explorers were shocked at the height of the Timucua, who averaged 4 inches or more above them. Timucuan men wore the hair in a bun on top of the heads, adding to the perception of height. Measurement of skeletons exhumed from beneath the floor of a presumed northern Utah mission church at the Fig Springs mission site yielded a mean height of 64 inches for 9 adult males and 62 inches for 5 adult women. The conditions of the bones and teeth indicated that the population of the mission had been chronically stressed. Each person was extensively tattooed. The tattoos were gained by deeds. Children began to acquire tattoos as they took on more responsibility. The people of higher social class had more elaborate decorations. The tattoos were made by poking holes in the skin and rubbing ashes into the holes. The Timucua had dark skin, usually brown, and black hair. They wore clothes made from moss and cloth created from various animal skins. Language. The Timucua groups, never unified culturally or politically, are defined by the shared use of the Timucua language. The language is relatively well attested compared to other Native American languages of the period. This is largely due to the work of Francisco Pareja, a Franciscan missionary at San Juan del Puerto, who in the 17th century produced a grammar of the language and 4 catechisms in parallel Timucua and Spanish. The other sources for the language are 2 catechisms by another Franciscan, Gregorio de Movilla, 2 letters from Timucua chiefs, and bits and pieces in other European sources. Pareja noted that the word and dialects of Timucua, which were usually divided along tribal lines. These are Timucua proper, Potano, Atafi, Ufera, Mocama, Agua Salada, Tucuru, Agua Fresca, Acuera, and Oconee.